In Katrina, two Newswire photos appeared side by side on the yahoo.com website. One showed a white couple finding food outside a convenience store. Another showed a black man looting. These pictures sparked a national discussion about racial stereotyping by the news media. Hi, I'm Pamela Monk. Welcome to World of Difference, the live call-in show where we talk about diversity issues. And our topic tonight is the one sparked by those iconic photos, racial stereotyping by the media. I have two guests with me in the studio tonight, both of them from the College of Communications at Penn State University Park. Mary Beth Oliver is a researcher who studies how the media portrays racial groups and how media portrayals affect viewers' racial attitudes. Russell Frank is a former newspaper reporter and editor who teaches reporting methods and news media ethics. He also conducts research on the tension between journalism's storytelling and truth-telling functions. We also want to hear from you. You can call us at 1-800-543-8242, and that's a toll-free number, 1-800-543-8242. And we want to get your calls on the air, so don't wait until the end of the show. Call early. Okay, so we're going to start right away, I think, with those the media reporting of Hurricane Katrina and those two photos. And as a researcher who studies these things, what was your thoughts about those photos in particular when you saw them?
Well, for me, they exemplified the kind of concern that people who study media and racism and its influence on viewers, they just exemplified, why there is a concern. Because, frankly, they were almost the exact same photos. I could have used them in an experiment. They looked exactly the same. The people were doing the exact same things, and yet they were framed in completely different ways.
Okay, so you saw them as a textbook example of perhaps of bias.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But Russell, you have some thought. Was there more to it than that?
There's a lot more to it than that. It's there's a lot more there than meets the eye. We talked about this in my ethics class last fall as soon as it happened, and it's the kind of thing where if the photos were taken by the same photographer and the same person had written the captions, and so you have this one consciousness calling it looting when it's done by a black person and calling it finding when it's done by a white person, then you'd really have cause to question. But it turns out it was two photographers working for two different organizations, working independently of each other. Like, neither knew that their photos were going to be juxtaposed later, which it turns out they were. And so, there's all kinds of reasons why a person might have chosen one word rather than the other. Looting is a sort of very loaded word in this situation, race aside. Is it looting if somebody gets a loaf of bread in a situation of catastrophe? And some people said no. But apart from that, you've got this, what it really teaches us is just how loaded an issue the race issue is. And so the only lesson that really comes out of this is how conscious we need to be about the words that we choose, because people may react. In this case, it was sort of a gross overreaction, I think, but that overreaction tells us where just how sensitive this area is for people. So we have to be very careful.
So are there guidelines for choosing verbs for captions? I mean, what would be a cause for that? Picking looting over finding.
Well, the other thing, apparently, when the photographers themselves were interviewed, one said that some foodstuffs were floating, and they were not. That it was not an image of somebody who had gone into a store and taken objects out, which sounds like a definition of looting. It was stuff was floating around and people picked it up. And so that's why that photographer chose finding. In the other case, it was somebody, apparently, who had gone into a store. So there was a little bit difference in the behavior, although, again, the power and the resonance of the word looting in a situation like that remains. As, is that the right word? Because it's very accusatory. People should not be doing this. And other people say, well, how could you blame people for getting a loaf of bread in a catastrophe?
Yeah. Have you done any looking into the effect that something like a blogger can have on sort of amplifying issues?
Well, looking at how the internet plays a role in this is really new. I mean, most of it, because, obviously it's just something that's that is new, but it's also hard to look to see, you can't contain it in terms of the content in the same way that you can with television. There are a finite number of channels and you can content analyze them and see, you know, how that's operating, and it's much harder to do with blogging, for sure. So most of the research in my area has really been done in television, magazines, newspapers, more traditional media, but certainly the internet's going to be
so
next.
that's beginning to change the landscape, but people don't really know how yet.
Not
just
yet.
Waiting to see.
Yeah, and also how it affects people is difficult to judge because there's so much room for selection. You know, so if I say I'm a heavy internet, you know, consumer, that doesn't tell you a lot about what exactly it is that I'm looking at. Whereas if I'm a heavy television viewer, then you can kind of make assumptions about the kind of thing I'm seeing. You know.
Okay, let's talk about Katrina a little bit more. There were rampant stories going on about horrible things at the Superdome and at the convention center, and then it turned out that later on that it wasn't true. What was going on with that? Why was that? Why were reporters rushing to make these sorts of comments? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It was hard to get good information initially. Rumors are rampant, and people tend to believe in and then spread stories that conform to what they already believe about the world. And so I think, you know, yes, we live in this culture where, you know, white America sees, you know, this Superdome teeming with these black residents of New Orleans, and they're sort of appalled. And instead of, you know, feeling compassion for the victims, there's a certain element of disapproval there, like what's the matter with these people? Why couldn't they get their lives together to come up with the wherewithal to get out of this town and heed the warnings?
Why did they stick around when there was a hurricane coming?
Yeah,
that sort of thing?
you know, and there are people who just can't conceive of how resourceless you are, you know, if you're poor. And it's an issue more of class than race in a way, because it's just people who are poor. If you're poor, you don't have a credit card, you don't have money in the bank, you don't have a car, the wherewithal was just not there to escape. And so here they all are in the Superdome. And you know, people feel guilty about this, and they want to sort of slough off the guilt, and so they blame, you know, the victims. It's a classic, you know, reaction to situations like this. And then, you know, you hear about people behaving badly, even worse, because we have this idea that people should behave nobly during a disaster. We should help each other out, and it should bring out the best that is within us, and instead it brings out the worst in some people. And there's nothing new about that either. I mean, I read the David McCullough book about the Johnstown flood right after Katrina because I was curious. And so here, 100 years ago, there was looting then too. I mean, there was, you know, bad behavior then.
Right. Was race an issue in that, or is it?
No.
It was just
no.
Poor people versus
desperados, people who just take advantage of chaos to commit lawless acts because they can get away with it. But you know, the main thing is stories take hold. I mean, in a way, it's the same reaction as the reaction to the looting versus finding photos. I mean, once people have this idea in their head of what happened, it becomes very hard to dislodge it. And when people get angry, and you tell them, well, it's really not as bad as you think it is, they like to hang on to their anger.
Yeah.
And they're very reluctant to let go.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good point here for you to tell us about a little bit about the Media Effects Center. It's a lab that you co-direct, because you're trying to actually quantify some of these things we've been talking about.
Sure. I mean, I also, before I do, I think it's important too to note that I really do, people who study media effects have no idea as to the motivation for why these things are put on the air. I mean, that's a separate question.
That's a separate question.
Yeah, I mean, so
but related?
Oh, certainly it's related.
But you have to. You can't study everything. Okay.
Yeah. So the media effects lab in this area of research is designed to look at the psychological effects that media have on viewers, and so you know, it just so happens that I study media and stereotyping. But it's a very broad area, so it could be media and the internet, it could be media and emotion, media and entertainment, advertising.
Okay, and your particular field of interest is stereotyping.
That is a focus.
Okay, so what kinds of studies have you done? Can you give us an example of things that you found?
Well, I've looked at content. I mean, that's how it started, looking at reality police shows, actually.
Reality police shows, like Cops? Not Reno 911. No.
That wasn't on the air at the time that I was doing it. But yeah, it was it's looking at shows like Cops. It was Top Cops, I think, was on America's Most Wanted. And actually, I wasn't doing it to study race at the time. I was looking at violence and crime. But when I started, quantifying exactly who was being portrayed as the bad guy and who was the good guy on these shows, it was very evident that people of color were routinely cast as criminal suspects rather than police officers, whereas the opposite was true for the white characters. So that really got me interested in looking at this further in terms of content. But then I'm also interested in looking at how people remember what they see and process and why they like to view these kinds of images. So
what's an experiment like? Do you just like sit and count incidences, and then how do you test the effect on people? Other by asking them, or do you have other ways?
Well, in an experiment, typically what I would do is create some kind of stimulus. So it might be, for example, I would create a newspaper story, and I would vary, if it was about crime, I might vary the suspect, the race of the suspect in it. And then I could get your reaction to it. So maybe you've seen a crime story with a white guy in it, and someone else is seeing a crime story with a black guy, and I could get your reaction to it. I could ask you, and I do that sometimes, but that's a kind of a risky thing to do because people are very aware of what's socially acceptable and what's not, and so asking people their attitudes about race is often not the best way to go.
So we've gotten to the point where people at least know that they're not supposed to be racist or stereotyping.
Yeah, I would say.
That's not socially acceptable, but you find that people still are?
I think that we're all vulnerable to stereotypes. And the reason is, and this isn't me just saying this, I mean, this is a lot of research in psychology, but the idea is that if we live in a culture, in a racist culture, a culture with stereotypes, even if a person doesn't endorse those stereotypes, we are still familiar with them. So let's say take a stereotype of African Americans as criminal. Even if a person thinks that's a bad stereotype or a wrong stereotype, they're familiar with it. And what that means is that familiarity, that association, can play a role in our responses, even if we don't endorse them. If we're not aware that the stereotype has been activated or primed, it can play a role. And so I think it's really important for all of us to recognize that none of us are immune, to this.
Okay. Well, let's take a little time to just invite our viewers out there to join us. If you are just tuning in or listening to us, this is World of Difference, the live call-in show on WPSU where we talk about diversity issues. I'm Pamela Monk, and tonight's topic is stereotyping in the media. I have two guests with me in the studio tonight, Mary Beth Oliver and Russell Frank, both of whom are professors in the College of Communications at Penn State University Park. And we would like you to join us with your calls and your questions. That's a toll-free number, 1-800-543-8242. And that's 1-800-543-8242. All right, well, let's go back. We have a good balance here because you've studied this, but you've lived it as a reporter.
Well, and also we're kind of complementary in the sense that I usually am looking at what reporters are doing and why are they doing what they're doing.
Okay,
so it's sort of on the production end, and she's on the sort of reception end.
On the reception end. So let's go back. Let's go to the production end on the issue of crime. So when you were working in a newspaper, what kinds of decisions did people make when they decided to report about a crime? What were the decisions they had to make?
Well, if you look at police reports, race is always mentioned, just as a matter of course. And there's a tendency to think that anything we know, we should report. But you have to ask yourself, what's the relevance of race? Race is relevant when you have an at-large suspect. Somebody's on the loose, some armed and dangerous person. And at that point, it's helpful to provide a detailed description so that citizens, if they see this person, can then call the police and say, hey, I saw that guy, pick him up. And, so what do we mean by a detailed description? Well, race is part of it, but so is, he was wearing a gold earring in his right ear and a Cincinnati Reds ball cap and a green sweatshirt and a tattoo of an anchor on his left arm and, and so on. And the more detail you have, the more easily identifiable the person is. Sometimes you'll just see the race, though, and nothing else, because that's all they have. And so you might think, well, if that's all you have, it's better than nothing. But you sort of achieve nothing with that description. So all you've done is reinforce stereotypes, which are out there, certainly, that, as Mary Beth was saying, that the people most likely to commit crimes, at least in the public perception, and of course it's not true, by the way, are young black men. In fact, most crimes are committed by young white men. But I don't have the statistics at my fingertips.
Just by sheer numbers of young white men in the country, even. It's,
But so, if to just say, and this was what happened at Virginia Tech, too, we just had an Asian man. I don't know how many Asian students there are at Virginia Tech. There's a lot, right? I mean, there's a bunch,
So that was,
so you've not said anything helpful, really, and it's not so much reinforcing stereotypes when it comes to Asians, I think, because that's not what the stereotype is. But, you do make people wary or leery of,
that's the only characteristic you can give,
Yeah, if this person is at large, until you find out that he had killed himself, do you need to be worried about any
Asian person walking by?
Man you saw.
Let's take a minute here. We have a call, Lily from Zion. Lily, thank you for joining us. What's your question? If she's still there. Lily? Lily has gone away. Okay, so Lily's question was answered, or she changed her mind. But anyway, so let's go back to that idea of, you thought that people mention race, almost as a matter of course. Just a thought, they never mention gender, though.
Well, there's all kinds of things that don't get mentioned.
Yeah, so...
they don't mention that somebody's, favorite breakfast cereal is Cheerios, and one is really no more relevant than the other in that context.
I guess with a suspect, visual cues are what they're handing out, right? So race is one of the more prominent ones. Are there other... So in lieu of having anything to say, they can say some person just committed a crime and they have nothing to say, so race just fills in?
If I can I jump in?
Sure.
Actually, there was some research that I thought that was fascinating by, it was in local news in the Chicago area. And what they were finding is that when, and this was on television, but when criminal suspects were pictured, visually pictured, it was actually black men who were less likely than white men to be named. So in other words, it could be a crime about drugs in Chicago, and it would be video footage that would, of black men,
nameless black men.
Nameless black men. And so that's interesting to me that they were less likely to be named. And the argument was, and I think was compelling, is that when we don't identify a person with a name, we allow that person to represent a group. So the issue would be, who's doing this drug selling in an open-air market? I don't know the guy. It wasn't John Smith, or it was just some black guy. And and that was the potential danger. So
he stood in for a whole group.
Yeah, exactly.
As opposed to being an individual acting on his own behest. Okay, well, we have another call, Clifford from State College. Clifford, thank you for joining us. Question, comment?
I have a kind of an observation which sort of fits in. My radio's off because I didn't want it interfering with the phone. But over the years, I've watched NPR. I listen to NPR. I don't have a TV. And All Things Considered and Morning Edition chiefly. And I've noticed that every time they do a story on welfare, it's almost always black people that are being interviewed. Now, my understanding is that 70% of the people on welfare in this country are white, not black. So I don't know. I doubt if it's deliberate, but it just seems that, to me, I've noticed this over the years. And I'm wondering if this is some sort of projection of somebody. I don't know.
I have a question, Clifford. If you're not watching it on television, do you notice that they specifically say that people are black?
Well, you can really tell by the accents most of the time.
Okay.
I mean, really strong African-American accents.
Can I jump in here?
Yes, you want to jump in? Okay,
yeah,
comment.
Clifford, I think that's a really great observation. And if you were interested in it and bothered by it, there is a book actually by a man named Gillens called Why Americans Hate Welfare. And in that book, he was talking about, he content analyzed magazines, but he was finding that poverty was African Americans were overrepresented as impoverished. But it wasn't just that, it's the way that poverty was depicted when African Americans were used to exemplify that. And so it was African Americans who were depicted as non-working, who were overrepresented, where when it was a white person, they were more likely to be shown as the working poor, a more sympathetic sort of portrayal. And so Gillens wanted to make the argument that resistance to welfare we might even begin to wonder if that's not a sort of veiled racism. It's really resistance to African Americans.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
thank you. I just wanted to point that out.
All right.
I'll go back to my radio.
Okay. Thank you, Clifford.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah,
Now, I think we're going to try again with Lily from Zion. Lily, are you there?
I am. Are you there?
Yes, please.
Great.
Thank you for joining us.
Happy to. Always go back to the radio. There's a great book called Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria by a writer named Tatum that distinguishes among bigotry, prejudice, and racism. And that might help explain some of the things that Clifford was talking about. But I wanted to ask about, actually, Mr. Frank brought it up first, Virginia Tech. For a number of reasons, I think that's something that we need to talk more about. I was wondering if each of your guests could talk about how they might study Virginia Tech, because I think Dr. Oliver has a laboratory kind of mindset, a method that suggests experiments, and I don't really know about your other guest's method, but it would have to do maybe with covering it or the way the media covered it. But I think we need to talk more about Virginia Tech in this context. And so if it's okay, I'll hang up and just listen to your guests talk about that.
Yeah, that's okay. All right. Well, I think, Mary Beth, why don't we start with you, and also to mention that you have an actual connection to Virginia Tech. You were a teacher there?
Yes, I was.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Blacksburg, actually.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you have you also have a personal as well as a professional connection to how this was all covered.
Sure.
So Lily is wondering, how would you study this? And well, first, what's your estimation of how it was handled, and then what's to be learned from this?
Well, Russell and I were just talking about this before the show. I mean, clearly this is a tragedy it's a heartbreaking tragedy that happened, and my heart, and so, you know, that goes without saying. And then the fact that this young man was Asian is certainly, I know, even a further tragedy to people in the Asian community who are worried about, they're ashamed that he represents their community. They are afraid of retaliation, and I think that the people at Virginia Tech are very cognizant of that and are very guarded to make sure that that sort of retaliation doesn't take place. Studying it, I'll have to think about this.
Right, because you can't actually say you can't avoid the fact of his background, can you? Or is that just, how do you deal with that?
I think he was a sick kid with a gun,
Yeah.
you know, and he was a member of a group, and I think the worry is that people will think that he is representative of that group. But there's as much diversity and variability for certain in any community. So I don't think I guess the concern is how people will react to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there anything differently that you think reporters should have done in this about identifying the person or how it was handled in terms of racial stereotyping?
Probably there was no useful purpose to be served initially by just saying he was Asian. Later on, it's part of the background that you want to know who this person is, and that is part of who he is. And there'd be no reason to suppress that information. But at that point, it's in the broader context of knowing it's a fact about him among many other facts.
So it's not really the reporter's fault if the readers then jump to conclusions about Asian or Koreans in Korean communities because of the actions of one person? Or is there
Yeah, I mean,
anything?
some of those things are just idiotic. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I remember after September 11th, I mean, Sikhs, you know, were getting harassed, and, you know, they're not even Muslims. I mean, they're Sikhs, but they wore turbans, and so people are giving them a bad time. I mean, how stupid is that? See
very
somebody
stupid.
with a
It's really
turban,
stupid,
and you go
right.
after him because he's wearing a turban? I mean,
Right. So, but it's stupid. But what's that speaking to? Why do people do that? Have you looked into that? Like that sort of mass, that need to identify the other?
I think there's a really strong tendency for for people to homogenize outgroups. It's they all look alike sort of syndrome. I mean, and I think it's a matter of uncertainty. It's just uncertainty reduction. You know, we are all trying to operate. We operate. We're cognitive misers. You know, we try to make sense of the world with expending about as little cognitive effort as we can. And unfortunately, I mean, in many respects, that's great. I mean, it helps us get through the day. I can actually buy stuff at the grocery store and not have to process every single piece of information that I encounter. You know, so we have to do that to be sane. But one unfortunate, you know, outcome of that too is that we stereotype entire groups of people on the basis of.
It's just a mental
of this
shorthand that
one.
makes life simpler.
Mental, definitely, yes.
All right.
You know.
So how are reporters? Reporters have that same mental shorthand. So are they given some kind of training not to do that, or how?
well, there's been a big push over the last 20 years or so to have newsrooms. The expression is often to make the newsroom sort of look more like the community it serves, because for a long time newsrooms were sort of dominated by whites. And, you know, we have this objective tradition in journalism where we have this idea it really shouldn't matter, you know, what your sex is or what your ethnicity is, because you're supposed to be an objective reporter. And so some people have always felt like the model ought to be kind of like the blind audition. If you're, you know, there's an opening for a cellist in an orchestra, the maestro sits behind a screen, so he's, you know, he or she is not influenced by anything about the person other than how they sound on their instrument. And so people think, well, they ought to rehire reporters the same way. It shouldn't matter who you are. But in fact, we know that, you know, the news, the term that's always used is news is constructed. It's not, there are 1,000 decisions that go into deciding what the news is from one day to the next and how to report it. And, you know, if the entire newsroom consists of a bunch of middle-class white guys, the paper's going to read like it's put out by a bunch of middle-class white guys. You know, every aspect of who you are, race, class, sex, religion, where you grew up, how old you are, and on, your education are all going to influence how you see the world, what you respond to, what you think is a problem, what you think is interesting. And so, you know, the nice check on sort of the blind spots that we all have is to have people from a lot of different backgrounds in the newsroom. And so if you write a story where you mention that a suspect is black without any other information you know, connected with that, you'd like to think that, you know, anybody in the newsroom would notice that and say this doesn't really, this isn't really relevant. But if all the white guys in the newsroom don't notice it, maybe the black guy in the newsroom will notice it.
Right. That puts some kind of pressure on the black guy.
Well, there is a pressure there,
yeah.
and one of the things, you know, one of the problems in this big push, which hasn't really been it hasn't been as successful as newsroom managers would like it to be, is that then those reporters themselves get pigeonholed. You know, if I'm a white reporter, it's not there's no like white community that I'm going to be asked to cover, but, you know, Hispanic reporters get asked to cover Hispanic communities, and Asian reporters get asked to cover Asian communities. And to some extent this makes sense because there's a level of insight there's a level of access, you know, that, you know, black sources might feel more comfortable talking to a black reporter in certain kinds of situations. But at the same time, you start to feel, I think if you're a minority reporter in a newsroom, that you're just serving this narrow, useful, you know, almost like a public relations purpose for the paper, and you're not getting to stretch your wings and do all the other things that might interest you as a reporter that have nothing to do with race or ethnicity.
Well, I'm going to continue this, but let's just take a little break here. If you're just joining us, this is World of Difference, the live call-in show about diversity issues on WPSU Radio and TV. And tonight we're talking about racial stereotyping in the media. I'm Pamela Monk, and my guests are Penn State professors of communication, Mary Beth Oliver and Russell Frank. You can join the discussion. Call us at 1-800-543-8242, and that's a toll-free number, 1-800-543-8242. So the construction of the newsroom is then something that has begun to change. I mean, the complexion of the newsroom has begun to change. Have you noticed that?
It's changed, but it's there's been a retention problem, you know, so there's recruiting of minority reporters, and then they get hired, but they're having trouble keeping them, and I'm not sure why that is. I mean, you know, the newspaper business, the news business, has all kinds of problems that everybody's been hearing about, and this is just another one.
Well,
you know, layoffs, salaries, it's sort of a mess.
Well, there's lots of messes all around. That's just the mess we're talking about
This is
tonight.
the mess I'm interested in.
Yeah, really. This is your mess. But
yeah.
now, have you noticed as you study media effects, as newsrooms begin to change, because there is a concerted effort to bring diverse people into the newsrooms, that it's had some effect on the way news is presented?
Well, you can see changes. I would say that the biggest changes that we have seen have actually been with entertainment. And that's not to say that's not because necessarily that the news hasn't changed, but it's just that people study that year by year by year. Mm-hmm. And some huge changes have happened there, really, for the good. So, for example, now the percentage of African American characters are about representative with population percentages, and that definitely wasn't true even, 15 years ago. So that looks great, but other racial and ethnic groups still have a long way to go. So there have been some changes, but not completely like how it would be an ideal situation.
Yeah. Do you think it's having an effect on people's attitudes? Like, for example, people now are more aware of how they speak. They're not willing to they think before they say some of their things out loud.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I definitely see. I don't know if that's the television doing that necessarily, but
like what's driving it? Is the media driving the change, or are people changing and that's driving the media?
Well, I think it's probably chicken and egg. I mean, I would think that they're both at work, but certainly, I mean, now, for example, people who try to measure prejudicial attitudes, for example, would never just ask about flat-out stereotypes. I mean, there are other means of asking people, modern racism, symbolic racism, because those kinds of that kind of language just isn't acceptable. I think people realize that.
Well, yeah, we've had some stellar examples of unacceptability of language having
right.
Yeah. But before we go talk about that, we have a caller, Amanda from Clarion. Hi, Amanda. Thank you for joining us. What's your question?
How are you?
I'm good.
I was just listening in, and as a recent alumna of Virginia Tech, I was interested with what you guys were talking about, and I was wondering if the panelists could talk a little bit about the difference in the media coverage for things like this, these great tragedies that happen in white communities, versus the horrific things that happen in Black or Hispanic communities, and just kind of the gap in the news coverage between those tragedies that occur.
Okay. Well, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, actually, because it was something I was thinking about today, and I think I might have forgotten about it otherwise. This came up a lot in the late 90s when the coverage of all the shootings at the high schools occurred. And, there's this tremendous outpouring of shock. How could such a thing happen in a place like this? And a lot of commentators pointed this out, that what was implicit there was that things like this are not supposed to happen. I actually did a search of newspaper databases for that phrase, like, variations on the idea of things like this are not supposed to happen in places like this. And the idea, what was implicit was, in white suburban, white affluent communities, violent crimes are not supposed to occur. And so we expect them to occur, in Hispanic and Black neighborhoods in the inner city. And so we don't get too worked up about it. We're not terribly shocked. We're shocked when it happens to white kids. And there's something really sort of appalling about that. Because, first of all, if there's one thing this succession of shootings in the 90s should have taught us, is that, in fact, there are, sad, unhinged kids. There are sad, unhinged people anywhere, and their weapons are available just about anywhere, Lord knows. And so people could just go off anywhere, and no place is safe. I mean, look at the coverage of the Amish schoolhouse shooting, too. How could such a thing have happened here? Well, folks, violence happens anywhere in America. Get used to that idea. No place is safe. No place is shielded or insulated from that kind of violence. But it's a good question. Why aren't we as shocked at violence in the inner city as we are when it happens in Littleton, Colorado?
Yes. Why? Is there some research that discusses that? Is that just why do you think that's so?
Well, the why question is something that I guess I would have to let Russell answer. But yeah, I mean, this kind of not giving attention to crime victimization in minority communities is something that researchers have definitely noticed. And this is true with kidnapping stories and things like this. But systematically, there's a researcher named Travis Dixon who's he showed, for example, in Los Angeles community, that he could compare the number of victims in LA and perpetrators of crime with how they were represented in the news. And so black crime, black victimization of crime is underrepresented.
It's underrepresented.
But the perpetrators are overrepresented.
Right.
Yeah. Consistently.
Right.
It's a consistent thing.
You know, it's a great example to talk about of this is USA Today recently ran this story about NFL players who had been arrested. And I think the number was something like 48 guys had been arrested in recent years on a variety of charges. And they ran mugshots of every single one of these guys. And I think something like 46 out of the 48 were black. Now, you could argue that, well, if they were black, then they were black, and that's just the facts, and you wouldn't want to hide those facts. But again, by printing those mugshots in the paper, that was the most salient aspect of that story. That's what leaped out at you. It's like, look at all these black faces, one after another after another. And really, what's the relevance of their race? There are a lot of black guys in the NFL. This we know. You know, what was the relevance of, by running the photographs of them, especially in mugshot form, you know, that becomes, you know, what they wanted you to focus on is their race. And really, the fact that they were people committing crimes, their race is, it seems like that's a relevant fact, but is it? Why, and why is it? It's not really.
If it wasn't an article about race.
Yeah. And again, this is a big, you know, I could see, getting back to the issues of diversifying newsrooms, you could see where small papers have trouble in rural areas having diverse staff. But you figure the big papers, they're on top of this. They're in big cities, and they're the ones that can be expected to have those kinds of sensitivities. But then you see something like that in USA Today, and you go, what were they thinking over there?
Yeah, that is a good question. We have a caller, Andra from Harrisburg. Thank you for joining us. What's your question?
Hi. I was wondering about some of the girls from my high school wanted to go to Penn State to play basketball, and I wondered about Coach Portland and if that fits into the conversation at all.
Well, I don't know exactly. I mean, Coach Portland has resigned, so she's no longer the coach.
I didn't know if it is something to do with media coverage.
I wonder. I mean, do your girls have concerns about how it was covered and that's preventing them from applying? Would you repeat the question again so we can?
Just whether the Coach Portland thing has anything to do with the conversation you're having.
So your question is that, is the media coverage of what was going on here at Penn State with the coach, the basketball team, you think that perhaps has affected people in Harrisburg or people who might want to apply here? Is that your question? Well, do you think that?
I think what she's getting at is this sort of the accusations that were leveled against Reedy Portland about being homophobic, and
there was racial,
and so was that were those concerns about her brought to light? Was there any attempt to suppress this as long as the basketball team was successful? I mean, there was a lot of whispering going on for quite a long time about this aspect of her tenure as coach, and then finally it sort of blew up in this this lawsuit by this former player. So I mean it pertains.
So do people have to pick and choose? Well, I mean, that's a news story. That there was a lot of picking and choosing going on there, or was that more straightforward? I don't know. I guess I don't actually know that. That's a good question that we're probably not going to answer here tonight.
Yeah, I mean it raises questions. How protective is the local news media of Penn State's reputation,
Right.
or is the local news media, willing to go after Penn State when Penn State deserves going after?
Well, speaking as a local news media, let's move on.
Yikes.
But yeah, really, but it is a good question, So, anyway, well, we were talking about, this sort of fascination with pretty white girls. What's that about? Like Natalie Holloway, or maybe years and years of John Benet Ramsey. Is there something to be learned from that, or are people taking lessons from that? I'll start with Mary Beth.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing, not knowing, not being a journalist, but I would guess that the sort of assumed audience that's out there is a white audience, is a white audience who would find that particularly shocking, particularly exciting, particularly noteworthy, and so I think that it reflects the sort of viewer that's assumed to be out there. But in the long run, I believe it prioritizes what are the important issues. When is this important to be thinking about? Or at least I would hypothesize that that's how it influences the viewers.
Right, but is there some kind of who's making the editorial decision to press these cases and get the publicity out there? It must be a conscious choice on somebody's part to follow a story.
A conscious choice to follow the story, but perhaps a not quite conscious choice to ignore, those kinds of things when they happen to black kids, and to pay attention to them when they happen to white kids. And it's not just, kidnappings and so on. There was a few years ago, a woman in Iowa had septuplets, and she got all this attention, and there was a black woman, I think, in Houston who had octuplets, and, she didn't get nearly the attention that the woman in Iowa did. Why?
Is that because somebody has a better PR guy?
Well, not the moms. I'm sure there was no PR machine working for them. And more seriously, you have the issue of the difference in our response to what was happening in Rwanda in the early 90s versus our response to what happened in Kosovo in the late 90s. And you can't help but think that part of what conditions that response is the idea that for white America, the Rwandans, they are not us. They don't look like us. This is not our affair. And, we can't go rushing in. We can't be the world's savior and policeman. We're just going to leave that situation alone. Of course, the United States always has, if not the moral responsibility, at least the, it needs to be discussed. When you're the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth, what do we do when we see genocide, we see human rights violations being committed elsewhere in the world? When do we respond? How do we respond? In Rwanda, we did nothing. 800,000 people were killed. In Kosovo, NATO went in. And so why was their intervention in one case and not in well, partly we felt guilty about our failure to respond in Rwanda, and so we responded in Kosovo. But also, at the time that this was being covered, there was some discussion of, when you look at the Kosovars, they looked kind of like the Jews going on, refugees that had these sort of Holocaust echoes to it.
Maybe making up for not doing stuff during World War II.
Yeah.
So.
But, you can't help but come to the conclusion that for white America, European lives are just, this is to put it really crudely, but I think accurately, that European lives are more valuable to Americans than African lives.
To white Americans, to the news media in America.
Exactly.
Oh,
yeah. Okay. This whole discussion here about why journalists are doing what they're doing. I think that we can point to some noteworthy examples where I think that stereotypes of race were deliberately used. So, for example, a Willie Horton ad. I think that was like an example.
Notorious.
Yeah.
Which was, just to remind people, it was the ad that George Bush Sr. used against Michael Dukakis.
Correct. Right. Yeah. About prison furloughs. Or the cover of Time magazine when O.J. Simpson's skin tone was darkened. The argument was that
That's a good one.
They did that? Seriously?
Yes.
And what was the reason for it? Did anybody say why?
I think they were saying that it was an artistic decision.
It was artistic, but behind that, we've had centuries of these notions that the darker your skin, the more sinister you are. And even within the black community, that's been true, you know, sort of racism kind of within the black community, you know, fairer skin was more desirable, darker skin less desirable, and so on. And the reason, this is kind of a great story, though, the reason that Time got busted for doing that is that Newsweek ran the exact same shot the same week, untouched. And so you had the sort of normal skin. O.J. Simpson's a relatively light-skinned black man, and so you had his normal skin tones in Newsweek and his darkened face in Time magazine, and so people noticed and began to ask questions. They said, "Oh, you know, we had no intention," but you know, the point is, I think, on a subconscious level, these you know, why did darkening his skin make the photo more dramatic? Well, because it was plugging into these sort of very
and you
long-held
think
notions.
It's possible that they could have done it unconsciously without, if they were. There was nobody there to say, halt, time out, what are you doing?
Yeah, they pleaded innocent, and they were, in a sense, but those
in a sense,
ancient racial attitudes were underpinning what they did.
Okay.
Well, but the thing that this discussion actually makes me want to say is that there seems to be this assumption that if we could get the media to stop, then all would be fine and good. Now, and I think that would take us a long way. But I also want to point out, of course, that when we consume media, when we watch, you know, a news program, a sitcom, that we're processing that information. I mean, we walk away, we interpret it differently, we remember things differently, we respond emotionally to it differently, and so a lot of how we react and how it affects us depends on what we bring to the table. And if we're talking about race, that might very well be in terms of our existing attitudes about race. And the reason that I want to say that is because I think, in addition to trying to change portrayals in the media, that it's really crucial, if we're concerned about effects, to make media literacy a bigger part of an educational curriculum than it is. I mean, we're going to, if we're typical, we're going to have spent over 9 full years of our life in front of the television set by the time we're 65.
And it's actually more, because I spend hardly any, and so other people are taking up the slack from me.
Oh, really? So there's people spending 18 years.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
But, I mean, that's a lot of time. And, you know, understandably, we have, in the schools, we have classes on how to read poetry and literature, and that's really important. But more attention to how we read media, critical viewing skills, I think would be really very helpful.
Now, I have a question. The media effects that you study, do you study the media effects on all different people, like of different backgrounds, or is it just, like, who's the media affecting? Is it affecting blacks and Hispanics and Asians as well as whites? Do they perceive things the same way, or is it, you know, who's being affected by this?
Well, my research has tended to focus on white viewers, because I've been motivated to study white racism, you know. But of course, people study it from a variety of perspectives. And so, for example, people have studied the effects of stereotyping on self-esteem, issues of self-esteem, or on stereotyping of their own group or other groups. I mean, I can have stereotypes of women, for example, even though I'm a woman, of course.
Yeah. Well, now you studied in New Zealand, right? And what was that like? What did you find there?
Well, it was great. But I'm analyzing the data. One thing I will say that I found very interesting was that I was interested in their perceptions of white and black people in the U.S. And part of that is, the reason I was interested in that is because they get a lot of media from the U.S. So they have our Law and Orders, and they have all of our U.S. shows. And, you know, of course, that becomes a large source of information, you know. And so whenever we don't have direct contact with a group, I mean, that's when media can be particularly influential. They told me, the students I was working with and developing questionnaires there, I had a question on there, what % of people, white people, black people, do you think own a handgun? They said, that's a stupid question. Everybody in the U.S. owns a handgun. That's what they told me, really. And it's easy to see why they might think this if you're, you know, a heavy consumer of crime shows.
Yeah, right. People
right?
are right. So that's their contact with us.
Yeah.
Wow. So I have a question for you, Russell, about the code of ethics. You said that are there guidelines that reporters are given, and are they, like, who gives it to them besides journalism departments when they get out in the field?
The College of Communications here, the ethics class is required. I think at a lot of places where journalism is taught, there's now a required ethics class, or if it's not required, it's offered. There's a lot more emphasis on teaching ethics than there's ever been before. Most news organizations have their own code of ethics in addition to the Society of Professional Journalists code of ethics that's sort of just out there. It's toothless in the sense that if you violate the code of ethics, what can happen to you? Nothing. And it's a First Amendment issue. You can't enforce a code of ethics. I mean, individual news organizations can. I mean, you violate the New York Times code of ethics and you work for the New York Times, I mean, they can fire you.
So
if
you
it's
agree
a serious
to that?
Offense.
So you agree to a code of ethics when you sign on?
What you fear sometimes is that the code of ethics just sits in everybody's drawer and never comes out. But, I do want to say one thing, which is, we're spending a fair amount of time sort of bashing press coverage, and it's an easy thing to do, and it's a refrain you hear again and again. But really, it's a bit unfair. I mean, as a former reporter who has tons of respect for lots and lots of reporters who do good work, and it's important to be aware that, first of all, that the flip side of this is that it's the press that often takes the side of the oppressed and the powerless and the voiceless in our society, and that's been true for quite a long time. And that, what we're focusing on are sort of blind spots. And, yes, the press has its blind spots when it comes to issues of race and stereotyping, and that's what we're highlighting. But, it's important to just recognize that there's a bigger picture there it's important to just look at what the press does well and what it doesn't do so well. And, if we find out about a specific situation where someone is being oppressed or abused in some way, we're there and we're defending them. When it's sort of systemic, ongoing problems of racism and poverty and so on and so forth, if there's no real news hook here, there's not like some immediate thing that happens that draws our attention, we're not so good at that.
Okay.
We're very good when things, a hurricane happens, in the on the Gulf Coast, we're there, and we're there with everything we've got, and we just blanket coverage it, But in terms of the underlying, problems that were exposed by Hurricane Katrina, of, just sort of shocking poverty in New Orleans, where were we during all the years before that, making us aware of the plight of people like that? We were absent. So there's things we're good at, and things that we're not so good at.
All right, we have a caller, Josie from State College. Josie, thank you for joining us. What's your question?
My question and an observation is about the subjects of the subjects of news reporting. In other words, the people that you're actually reporting on and the diversity of their reactions to your questions, whether even they may respond or not respond, doesn't that have an impact on what you're reporting? Because perhaps some of the people that might have have had a bird's eye view or maybe have the greatest insight may actually be hesitant or reluctant or even refuse to speak to the media. And doesn't that diversity of the actual subject have something to do with the whole puzzle?
Okay, getting people to speak honestly. Is that a difficulty?
It's a good question. It's a complicated question. It's who you choose to speak to, and one aspect of this is sometimes referred to as the golden Rolodex, that reporters tend to over-rely on expert sources, on government officials, and so you get sort of a biased account that favors the people in power over the people who don't have power. And then, who do you talk to? What questions do you ask them? Sometimes, in a way, you can't win because, one of the things that something like Virginia Tech exposes is that sort of predatory dimension of news gathering when people are suffering from a terrible tragedy, and we're glomming onto them and trying to ask them how they feel, and people hate the news media when they do that. And it seems like that's the kind of thing where people say, leave them alone, don't be bothering people in these situations. But you can make arguments in favor of those kinds of interviews as well. But I think, what she's getting at is just that in terms of how compared to how social science research is done, it's so incredibly unscientific. You know, this sort of the sampling of opinion out there. You know, and the danger of making generalizations. You know, you go and talk to 3 or 4 people, and you start to characterize people's response to some larger situation in the world based on a handful of interviews. And, you know, are these people outliers? Are they mainstream? We have no idea. Okay. So that's a good point to make.
Well, we're coming up towards the end. Do you have any last thoughts on the topic about what an ideal goal, anything?
Well, I can't harp enough on media literacy. I mean, it's just crucial. I think it's kind of amazing that we don't spend more time trying to understand how we respond to media, how to be more literate viewers and critical viewers. And I think doing that would be a huge benefit to us as audience members, as consumers, and it would take some of the burden off of, you know, making journalists the total bad guys, and giving us some responsibility for what we consume and how we react to it.
So in the end, the ideal thing is not to put the burden on the reporters, but also to make the viewers and the readers educated consumers of the news, so they can pick and choose what makes sense to them.
Ideally, it would be a diverse content and a literate audience.
Okay. Well, that's all we have time for tonight. If you'd like more information about our topic, please visit our website, wpsu.org. I also want to thank our guests, both professors in the College of Communications at Penn State University Park. Mary Beth Oliver is a researcher who studies how the media portrays racial groups and how media portrayals affect viewers' racial attitudes. Russell Frank, a former newspaper reporter and editor, teaches reporting methods and news media ethics, and also conducts research on the tension between journalism's storytelling and truth-telling functions. And thanks to all of you for your calls and comments. Join me again for World of Difference next month, when we'll continue our conversation about diversity issues. See you then. For Penn State Public Broadcasting, I'm Pamela Monk. Good night.